All right, so we left off talking about the characteristics of folk culture or traditional culture. Today we're going to focus on talking about the characteristics of pop culture. So sometimes this is called global culture, and we'll contrast some of the characteristics of global or pop culture with the characteristics we talked about dealing with folk culture. So we mentioned that folk culture is typically practiced by small groups of very homogenous people. Typically, these people are living in isolated rural areas, whereas global pop culture is usually practiced by large groups that are very heterogeneous, right? Large heterogeneous groups. These people are very different. People that are different races, different ethnicities, different nationalities, different religions can all share cultural characteristics from the same place. So typically, these people are going to be living in urban areas or a lot more urban, right? And they're interconnected through internet, media. These kinds of culture are going to be very, very quick to change, whereas folk culture is very, very slow to change. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So some of the specific cultural traits of global or popular culture. Their architecture is going to be much different. Whereas folk culture use things from the natural environment, architecture from pop culture is going to use things that are manufactured, things that come from factories, stuff like glass, steel, cement, drywall. These kinds of things are not things that you would find just laying around in an environment. You have to produce these and manufacture them. The land use, instead of being agricultural, it's going to be very urban and suburban. And we talked about this concept earlier in the year and the other day as well. And because of the way the land is used and all of the material is manufactured and comes from factories and those kinds of things, it illustrates the concept and of placelessness, which is the lack of uniqueness of a place. The idea that there is what we call a uniform landscape. Everything starts to look the same. This shopping mall could be in New York City, or it could be in Beijing, or it could be in Los Angeles or London. You don't know based on what the landscape looks like. It illustrates the same kinds of neighborhoods that are developed all around the country and in a lot of cases around the world. So that is what placelessness means. A couple of other characteristics of popular culture. The origin typically is going to be from a very specific place and time. Remember, contrast this with folk culture, and the place and time and the origin of folk culture is very anonymous, right? So this is going to be a specific place and time. Dates can be traced back to specific times, and typically the hearths of these places of cultural characteristics is going to be large cities in more developed countries. Think, where do we get movies from? Where do we get cars from? Where do we get music from? We get it from New York, Detroit, um, Los Angeles, right? Hollywood. Where do we get fashion from? Paris, New York, Milan, those kinds of places. In Innovations in technology come from Silicon Valley near San Francisco. These are examples of modern culture hearths that we have things that come from large cities in more developed countries. Typically, the diffusion for pop culture is going to be very large scale and rapid. Contrast that with folk culture, which was small scale and slow. Folk culture diffused through relocation diffusion, while pop culture diffuses through expansion diffusion. Things like hierarchical and contagious diffusion. We'll talk about the differences between those later. The distribution is going to be very widespread. We've kind of already hit on this a little bit. Many countries will be involved. And the obstacles to spreading are not going to be physical features like they were in folk culture. They are going to be lack of access, usually having to do with income levels. We'll say poverty. People don't have access to be exposed to certain types of music or movies because they might not have televisions or they might not have internet or something like that. So this is just a graph showing you or a map showing you what internet was like in 1995, and you can see that there were some areas that were very way ahead, right? Western Europe, the United States and Canada, and the rest of the world was very far behind. It starts to catch up, right, in 2000, and other countries in Latin America start to catch up a little bit in Asian countries. And then by 2011, most of the rest of the world is caught up, with the exception of Africa still lagging behind, but they're still way far ahead of where they were even in 1995. So things happened very rapidly and they spread globally throughout the world as it pertains to pop culture. So another discussion we want to talk about is the variation in culture compared to with local compared to pop culture. So the variation in culture that is considered local or traditional culture is going to vary from place to place. It's going to differ from place to place, kind of like what we talked about when we mentioned the culture in the Amazon rainforest of some tribe is going to be much, much different than the cultural characteristics of some group living in Siberia, right? So that's kind of what we mean. But when we talk about culture traits of popular culture, they don't differ from place to place. They typically differ from time to time. Right? In the 80s, everyone on the planet that practiced pop culture was listening to MTV, and they were drinking Coke and they were wearing Adidas and those kinds of things. So it doesn't differ from place to place, it differs from time to time. Fast forward to the 90s, which was on our last screen here. Fast forward to the 90s, and everyone in the world is watching these movies and listening to Britney Spears and driving these kinds of cars and watching Austin Powers and those kinds of things. So that's what we mean when we say it differs from time to time instead of from place to place. This is just another example, right? Very unique culture is going to look different from any culture in the world. Very popular culture where everybody on the planet is going to be experiencing and exposed to it. And this next slide is just a chart that compares the two cultures in, and this is slide 15. If you want to, if you want to make a note to go back and study this, it just kind of compares the two in a nice clean little slide, right? Isolated versus large, homogeneous versus heterogeneous, changes little, changes frequently, place to place, time to time, like we talked about. Threatened by globalization. This isn't what one of the things we talked about, but it's going to be one of the things we talk about on the next slide. This is becoming dominant because of globalization. More sustainable, less sustainable, less expansive, more extensive, right? And that's what we're going to hit on our next slide. So this is a quick little chart to compare the two if you want to make a note to come study this. So let's talk about sustainability for a little bit. So sustainability refers to the ability, we're going to define it up here. It's the ability This is a word that it's kind of a hot button word in today's culture. We talk about sustainable this and sustainable that. We'll define it and we'll discuss it. It's the ability to be maintained at a certain level. Right. So the idea is that if something is sustainable, it doesn't put too big of a burden on anything that it can't be sustained in for a long time in the future. If something is considered unsustainable, it's the idea that okay, we're using too much of our resources, or we're messing the planet up too much to where if we continue to perform this at this level, it's going to result in catastrophic things, right? So that's kind of what sustainability means. So sustainability is the local or traditional cultures are considered much more sustainable in terms of how they affect the planets, but they're considered less sustainable in the sense that they are endangered of being overtaken by pop culture. So we'll say folk culture typically are considered endangered, so they are not considered sustainable in that regard. They're endangered because of interaction with pop culture. People are leaving their traditional societies and they are moving into the cities, and they're adopting more pop cultural characteristics. Globalization kind of promotes uniformity in this sense. It kind of encourages everyone to be the same. And one of the things that makes it less sustainable here is the in a lot of these traditional cultures, the status of women is not considered equal, and they're not treated equal. So we'll say status of women is challenged. So that is something that many would consider a positive thing about some of these local cultures losing some of their cultural practices. We also want to make a note here that, and we'll just add it over here. It is less taxing on the environment. Right. So local cultures are considered more environmentally friendly in that regard because they don't take things and manufacture things on a large scale and take huge, large, enormous amounts of resources to produce what you know what this looks like. All right, let's move on to sustainability in pop cultures. There are certain groups that are fighting this kind of thing right here. We'll say pollution of the landscape. Let me make a better thing here. So, pollution of the landscape. Um, this is the idea that, like, in certain places, in a lot of places, they don't want huge, gigantic signs and big neon flashing things that take away from the natural environment. I know that in Destin, my father-in-law lives in Destin. There are laws. If you ever drive around the city in Destin, you'll notice that none of the signs can be above like 6 feet in height, and everything has to look very, very similar. And it has to be, it's a lot classier kind of look than something like this, where you have all these giant signs and, and really bright colors and stuff like that. So there are groups in certain cities that are fighting this kind of thing where they want things to look nice and they don't want things to get touristy and they don't want every place to look the same and that kind of thing. And then they also will add puts a more strain or more heavy strain on the environment. Popular culture does in general. Things like big stadiums or golf courses take up huge sections of land, and the pollution that it takes to manufacture the stuff that we use in pop culture, those kinds of things are, bad for sustainability. All right, so that is going to be it for our notes today. You should use the rest of class today to work on some of the things you have coming up. The vocab quiz is coming up. We have a map quiz coming up. We have a regions quiz tomorrow. There's your current event article that you can be working on. So all those things are fair game. And I'll see y'all tomorrow.